Prime Minister says we need to go faster on increasing defence spending, which sounds great for the forces, except we still don't know how the money already in the budget is going to be spent. The Defence Investment Plan, the DIP, is months late with still no date in sight, so the forces don't know what kit they will or won't get, making their job of becoming war-ready even harder. And defence manufacturers say all the uncertainty risks the future of businesses meant to equip the armed forces.
To meet the wider threat, it is clear that we are going to have to spend more faster.
So we're working flat out to deliver the DIP and make the choices necessary.
Defence Explained.
It's the opportunities being potentially missed. Our troops haven't got access to some of the cutting-edge technologies that we're seeing.
This is Sitrep with Kate Gerbeau and Professor Michael Clarke.
Mike, it's more than 8 months since you and I sat with General Sir Richard Barrons discussing the defence review he'd just helped write. The DIP is the spending plan that's supposed to turn that high-tech vision for the forces into reality, and it's still AWOL.
Yes, it is, and that is very disappointing. The defence review itself took a long time to come out and was delayed, and it was finished, I know for a fact, in January, February, and didn't come out for some months because it was causing ripples at the centre of government. And when it did come out, some of the edges have been knocked off it, not many, but some. And the Defence Investment Plan is the guts of what is now supposed to happen. And so this delay is not in any way good. It takes away that sense of urgency that the SDR was meant to engender, and this just been drifting away. So as Richard Barrons keeps saying, we know what we need to do over the next 10 years, and time is already tight politically to do it. And here we are, we're wasting best part of another year. And the effect of morale on industry, if they don't know what the investment plan is, they begin to wonder if the government is serious about all of the commitments it's making rhetorically to increase defence expenditure.
And Mike, has any work towards that new blueprint for the forces been able to happen since it was published, or has everything been on hold until the DIP is signed off?
Oh, no. I mean, certain things are happening. So forces have been reorganising themselves, and they've been working on adjusting the current budget. So they've been retiring some equipment early and trying to bring forward the introduction of new equipment. That's all okay. Again, it's not as fast as we would like, but it's not that nothing is happening. But defence investment is all about the industrial partnership between government and industry in order to really gear up for war-fighting capability. And that's the point. It's the big stuff now. Defence investment in industry, and if that's not happening, or if it's not happening quickly enough, then there's only a certain amount that the MOD can do within its present budgetary guidelines. Until it knows how much more of a budget it might be getting and what the time scale of that is, it can't really develop from the improvements it's already trying to make.
And that creates a new problem, though, doesn't it? Early retirement and delayed spending means gaps that weren't planned for.
Yes, and that's the whole point. I mean, you can see gaps opening up already in certain things that are being laid off. And it looks as if the Type 31 programme for new frigates looks as if it's now been pushed sideways because we're selling some of them as we build them to our allies. And that's a good idea in principle, but that should create gaps to allow for more shipbuilding. But until the Defence Investment Programme is available, we don't know how feasible that is. And that's just one example.
Well, also with us is Sian Grzeszczyk Melbourne, Westminster insider for BFBS Forces News and Sitrep. Sian, hi. Let's be clear, it's not just us saying it's taking too long. The government has missed its own deadline on this too.
Yes, Kate. I mean, the whole picture just looks more and more messy the longer the defence world has to wait for this. We were meant, of course, to have got eyes on at Christmas. We're still waiting amidst, of course, those rumours of a £28 billion black hole in the defence budget. And while we wait, the frustration and I would say anger now is building. And we see that in this open letter to the Prime Minister signed by 3 former defence secretaries and retired senior military chiefs, warning that the armed forces have been hollowed out by years years of chronic underfunding. They are calling on the Prime Minister to commit to what they describe as a bold, credible and measurable path to raise defence spending to 5% of GDP. In a letter to him this week, they're saying, you must recognise that we are facing our 1936 moment. Global conflict is highly likely if we don't invest in deterrence now. A week is a long time in politics, but we've been waiting for the dip for months now. As Mike said, it's everything's on hold. A lot of things are on hold until the big decisions are made. And I think the longer we wait, the more painful it gets day by day, because it just feeds into that uncertainty, especially in regards to industry.
And Sian, everyone is wondering why they've missed their own deadline. One theory is they can't do it until a decision is made about Ajax. That's £6 billion of uncertainty right now. Is it just that, Sian?
Well, that's what I asked the Defence Minister, Louise Sanders-Jones, and like all other ministers, she just repeated the "we're working flat out" line. They've been repeating that line since Christmas. Everyone must be absolutely exhausted. And she certainly wasn't falling into the trap of making any reference to Ajax when I tried to get to the heart of whether that was at the crux of the situation and responsible for the huge delay. My military contacts are very much saying, it's all firmly in the political sphere now. The military chiefs have done all they can to make the case. A contact who was in the room to hear Kaz speak at an event early this week said he seemed quite upbeat despite the uncertainty, but anyone who's ever met the current Kaz knows he's quite a smiley character. If only we could see those serious conversations happening between the chiefs behind closed doors right now. And again, I think that's why we've seen that open letter from former chiefs and former defence secretaries who are really trying to pile on as much pressure as possible publicly at the moment. But let's not forget that this is one of a million headaches facing the Prime Minister right now. A Prime Minister who is deeply unpopular, who is now facing more council elections in May. And every time he does a U-turn, and there have been plenty of those now, haven't there, he gets more grief. So I think it's important to remember that as the wider context and backdrop to this.
Mike, are you hearing anything about why we're in this situation?
Well, only, as Sian said, it's top-level politics. The assumption generally is, among the commentariat, shall we say, is that this is pushback from the Treasury and that Rachel Reeves is just standing absolutely firm, and Defence have tried to approach the Treasury, as it were, separately and say, we just need to accelerate the increase in expenditure. And Keir Starmer at Munich last weekend said, we've got to do more, we've got to spend more quickly. And it was assumed early on this week that maybe they would announce an acceleration, bringing the 3% target closer and the 3.5% target closer, which seems a realistic thing to do. But it looks as if there has been pushback. And it will come down, I think, ultimately to a prime ministerial decision. Does Keir Starmer, in whatever calculation he makes in terms of his own future and his own standing as a prime minister, does he overrule his chancellor and risk maybe a resignation, which would not be a good thing before the elections in May, or does he try to wing it and get through till after May and then assess whatever damage the May elections have done and then push the Treasury? But ultimately, the Treasury doesn't look as if it's going to budge on this. Most of us in the defence business think it has to, some way, and that must eventually come down to the Prime Minister. And, all Prime Ministers eventually either have a real partnership with their Chancellor or they get into difficulties with their Chancellor because Prime Ministers want to spend money and Chancellors don't want to do that, or they want to spend money in a more restrictive way. And this is one of those cases, I think, where we will see the future of the Labour leadership, as it were, laid out in terms of this argument about defence expenditure, because this is becoming really urgent. This is not the same as more expenditure on health or education or transport. Those things are priorities in themselves. But there is a timeline on this. There's a national importance on this. This is the most important defence expenditure issue we have had since the Second World War. And I think it will become the defining issue, probably, of Keir Starmer's future as a Prime Minister between now and, let's say, the summer and the autumn of this year.
Sian, I saw you nodding away through that, what Mike was saying. Are you getting that kind of vibe around Westminster yourself?
Yeah, and I think when you take a look at what people like the chair of the Defence Committee is saying, I spoke with Tandesi this week, and I think he sums it up quite well. You know, you can't keep kicking the can down the road. This is a really significant moment. And we have come to that point where the country does need to significantly boost investment in defence and security right now. And when you look at what James Cartledge, the Shadow Defence Secretary, is saying as well, you know, for all that Starmer said at Munich on the world stage, he was making the point, you know, until he publishes this dip, you know, and shows that he can stand up to his backbenchers, you know, talk of 3% defence spending is nothing more than a pipe dream. But I do sense that moment of urgency in a way that we haven't really seen before. And I mean, it's by the by. I don't know if you saw that stunt this week between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor on TikTok on Pancake Day. Did you see that?
I didn't actually know. Please describe it.
A very bizarre, cringeworthy attempt, I think, to appeal to younger voters, where the Prime Minister called the Chancellor into his office and he opened his red box, and in it were some American perfectly made fluffy pancakes, which he had obviously hadn't made himself, with a chocolate spread inside and everything else. And this sort of, you know, oh, let me and come and give you a treat sort of thing. Within the backdrop of all of this, you know, we know that she, as Mike said, is putting her foot down and saying no. You know, it was a very bizarre sort of side story, but I sort of, it just made me smile, because I think clearly right now he's got to do a lot more than a stunt with giving her pancakes to change her mind, and this is all at the crux of, you know, something that is so significant and so important, and the longer we wait, the messier it looks for them.
Well, putting pancakes to one side for a moment, and we'll tackle some of the other big questions in a bit, but I want to examine a bit more why this delay is a problem, particularly for small and medium-sized defence companies who ultimately help equip our armed forces. Brad Hayward is a former RAF aircraft engineering officer. He went on to become a senior commercial manager for the Ministry of Defence, and now chairs the committee representing SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, at defence industry body ADS. He told me that delays on spending decisions, not just with the dip, but also in the run-up to the defence review, have forced some defence companies out of business.
We are seeing, in terms of formal liquidation figures, in terms of published data, that liquidation of small businesses is still around a 30-year high, which is, you know, contextually currently, you know, a larger number than was experienced during COVID. So I suppose a lot of the initiatives and discussions that are ongoing are very, very positive to hear. But in terms of balancing the action versus the words, currently the lack of action is unfortunately impacting the small businesses currently.
So for a business in defence, why is uncertainty damaging when they know orders will appear at some point in the future?
So I think it's, to be crude, it's probably cash flow is probably the major challenge. You know, talking with relative confidence from a small business perspective, many people will say, you know, cash flow is king, to quote other people. But in a small business, I use the word rhetoric carefully, but the promises and the jam tomorrow of where we think defence is headed and where we predict the technology will be going is good, and that market intelligence is useful to help scope and scale your business. But until the cash starts flowing, eventually you hit a point where you have to make serious decisions about, whether you're refinancing or taking leveraging debt, or the far right of that discussion being liquidation. Is unfortunately the market does need stimulating with funding, and the lack of that activity in many areas over the last, I keep saying referring to 18 months, which is probably a little bit broader than that, has unfortunately led to lots of optimism in terms of the direction, but an inability to sustain small businesses during this period.
And defence businesses play a national role in supporting our armed forces and creating military capability. You know that from your time as an RAF engineer. What is the impact of this squeeze on businesses for the forces themselves?
I think it's the opportunities that are also being potentially missed. So, with the lack of diversity that will be available to operators in terms of technologies. As we've seen from the conflict in Ukraine, the technological advancements are moving far ahead of where we would have imagined. And in recent exercises have been well publicised in Estonia, etc., have demonstrated that although relatively well equipped, our troops haven't got access to some of the cutting edge technologies that we're seeing in the conflict in Ukraine and other areas around the world. So that innovation, that word's used a lot, but that innovation and that agile approach to defence capabilities is what generally small businesses excel at. You have ex-service personnel, mostly in a lot of these defence SMEs, that know the operator, having been that person, know the challenges, know the context, and know what the user wants. But it's trying to break into that market to present that solution to the Ministry of Defence to get it into the hands of the troops is probably the major challenge and probably a frustration.
And yet there does seem to be a disconnect here for some people. BAE Systems has just reported a 10% year-on-year increase in sales and a record backlog of orders. When we look at figures from ADS across the whole of defence industry, the value of the defence sector grew 70% from 2014 to 2024. That sounds pretty healthy for the sector.
Yeah, no, completely. And I think the sort of context again to those figures are that's obviously good news in terms of from a defence sector perspective, but the single sourcing of contracts to the defence primes within the MOD currently remains relatively high. Nearly half of all MOD contracts are non-competitive, so that doesn't give the smaller companies the opportunity to tender for those opportunities. So, and I understand contextually why that is the case. There's many of those capabilities and platforms are far outside of the experience and skills of a small business to deliver, but the increase in defence spend that we do see from an SME perspective, from a small business perspective, the actual spend with small businesses decreasing year on year at the moment. So although the overall spend in defence in the industry is, as we say, looking relatively healthy, the slice of that cake for the smaller businesses continues to get smaller and smaller currently. So welcome many of the initiatives that are being discussed.
Yeah, and the government on the dip would argue that it's better to get it right first time, and that justifies the current wait. Is there anything more that you think could be done to support defence businesses while they are waiting?
I think this opportunity, it's easy to say the cash flow is needed, having worked both in defence as an operator and in the Ministry of Defence itself as a civil servant. I understand the market, I understand the challenges, and I also understand, politically, the need to get this right and the importance on that. I think that the challenge is trying to balance our continually stressing how important the small business community is to defence in the UK, whilst not supporting it financially, and then whether the solution to that involves greater collaboration with the larger defence primes to try and support that supply chain in the UK and the innovation opportunities that reside in the UK. But yeah, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I think the lack of the cash flow is the predominant challenge to these businesses sustaining themselves long enough to get in the fight, to use that clunky analogy, but to be able to demonstrate what they can do for defence.
So what do you think when you hear the Prime Minister say we need to spend more faster on defence? Is it frustrating given the current waits?
I think it frustrates everybody. You see, both, I say both, but from a political perspective, from a department perspective in the ministry itself, from a supply chain perspective, I think it frustrates everybody. And it's been quite interesting, since my transition into industry, is working with a number of international suppliers. And you see the level of bureaucracy from a UK MOD perspective, having lived and breathed that bureaucracy myself, versus many of our allied nations and their approach to procurement, which is far more speedily completed, and the level of bureaucracy and the time taken to procure. But it's not applying a Cold War procurement process to agile and rapid technologies. I think there's not a one-size-fits-all, and I think currently we operate in a one-size-fits-all environment where a very similar procurement process will be used to build an aircraft carrier versus procuring 10 drones to deploy. And I think that needs to be tiered and tailored accordingly and the risk appetite the same.
Brad Hayward, it was great to speak to you. Thank you very much for that.
No, thank you, Kate.
And Mike, businesses come and go, but defence businesses are particularly specialist. How worrying is it for our military capability hearing the kind of impact these delayed decisions are having?
Yeah, well, more worrying than it used to be. I mean, the MOD has said for years that we must stimulate small, medium enterprises because that's part of the whole ecosystem of defence. We can't leave it all to the big primes like BAE. And BAE will say, oh, look, we bring the SMEs in. When we have a project, we look for small companies to collaborate with, which they do. But that's not the same as being able to stimulate the SMEs themselves. And in 2022, there was an SME strategy, an action plan that the government had as a result of the 2021 review. It didn't deliver anything, nothing. And the current action plan is intending to increase SME involvement in defence by about sixfold, to take it from about 1.2 billion of the procurement allocation to about 7.5 billion out of the procurement allocation. Well, I don't see how they're going to increase it sixfold unless they can give some certainty through the DIP, through the Defence Investment Plan, as to what is likely to happen. And Brad Hayward was exactly right. BAE Systems, they're a great company, but they can live through hard times. An SME can go bankrupt for the sake of 500,000 or 1 million. They lay people off. They simply can't continue to employ people with the necessary skills unless they know they've got cash coming through the door. That's in the nature of a small company. So it's very worrying, particularly now, because we all understand, I think, that defence will have to be much more innovative, more transformative, and some of the best ideas and the best prototypes are coming from pretty small companies who have to be encouraged and then bring them into the mainstream very, very quickly. It's got to be a bottom-up model, not a top-down model. And trying to make the top-down model a bit more inclusive has not worked in the past, not likely to work in the future.
So, Sian, big question then. When will we get the Defence Investment Plan? I'll just leave that on your shoulders.
Thanks. Well, I can reveal. I wish I knew. Everyone, of course, wishes they knew when the date would be. I mean, being in the dark like this with the backdrop of all the warnings we're getting about the threats we're facing, the need to act now, makes for a very uncomfortable situation. Now, it's recess this week for Parliament. I'm not expecting to hear anything this week, but we are continuing to see that pressure being piled on. Who knows when we will finally get eyes on the plan? How long's a piece of string, as my grandma would always say whenever I asked her a question she didn't know the answer to.
So, Mike, how long is that piece of string?
It's got to get a lot shorter. I don't know when it's coming out. I've not heard any rumours as to when it's coming out. All I hear is the frustration of people both privately inside the MOD and outside the MOD that the thing hasn't appeared yet, because the delay is because of a big political argument going on between Number 10 and the Treasury. That's what we know, or that's what we believe is the real problem. Because when the draft was put to the Prime Minister before Christmas, he sent it back to them on the assumption that he just couldn't live with it the way it was first presented to him. And so, the triangle between the Ministry of Defence, Number 10 and the Treasury is a sort of an eternal triangle, and the bit that seems to be stuck is the Number 10 Treasury bit at the moment. So that won't get resolved, in my view, perhaps until after the elections in May. I hope I'm wrong about that. I hope it comes out before then, but I fear that it won't.
So, Mike, you were in Munich for the security conference when the Prime Minister said those words, we are going to have to spend more faster. It kind of passed people by in the moment, possibly because he said we. You might have assumed he was talking about NATO rather than just the UK. Would it solve the issues that stand in the way of making our forces war ready, or would it just be throwing money at a problem and hoping?
No, I think we know what the money needs to be spent on. There's no sense that the MOD is still trying to reconceptualise how it will spend money. We know that certain things have got to be made up. I don't like to use the word black hole, but you know what we mean. Actually making good on some of the deficiencies which are already getting worse. So they've got to be filled in first, and that's important. And that's frustrating for politicians, because they can put money into something and they don't see an immediate improvement, because this is all, as of infrastructure and background stuff, but that needs to be done. And then the number of projects, and Ajax is only one of the issues. I don't think Ajax is holding the process up in any significant way, but there are a number of projects that really need to be funded urgently. And then the other big one, of course, is the nuclear enterprise. And one of the things, let's remember, that the SDR recommended is that the whole nuclear enterprise of the new generation weapons and the boats, the new class of missile submarines or the Trident submarines should be ring-fenced so that it doesn't keep draining the rest of the budget away. And whatever happens to the nuclear expenditure should not have the effect, which it has had so far since 2010, of literally opening up a tap at the bottom of the sink of every other sort of expenditure and draining money out of everything else. Shouldn't be allowed to do that.
And one rumour doing the rounds, Mike, is that Foreign Office spending could go down to increase defence spending, keeping things cost neutral, essentially trading off soft power for hard power. Could that be the right thing to do now?
I don't think it's the right thing to do, but you can see it is already happening because the integrated expenditure, an account which used to be the Conflict Security Prevention Fund and then was called an integrated fund, that is already being reduced and put on defence. And that was a sort of soft power fund looking at making a difference in conflict prevention and in pushing British ideas in partner countries and so on, in countries that could benefit from a bit more exposure to our view of the world and so on. All of that was useful expenditure, but it was hard to measure the effectiveness of it, whereas the hard power of defence expenditure, you know what you're buying. So that's already beginning to happen. More of it might happen, but to be honest, the Foreign Office is a very low spender in Whitehall terms. I mean, if you're looking at making a big shift in expenditure, and that's what we are looking at, and there are big priority decisions to make here, you have to think in terms of the whole welfare budget. So it's health, welfare, social security, education. Those are the big budgets that somehow you've got to reconcile with the need for more on defence. You can pull more money in from some other areas, but that's only small change, to be honest.
So, Sian, the idea is out there. The Prime Minister didn't try to quash it when he was asked the day after Munich. Any idea when we will get a definitive yes or no? The Chancellor has a spring statement to make next month, for example.
She does, and that's on the 3rd of March. I think we'd all like to know by then, but as Mike said, it might be that we have to wait till May. But just on the military spending, I've spoken to quite a few military sources and senior former military sources this week, and one in particular wanted to take me back to focus on the Hague summit that we saw last year, and they were just reminding us of how momentous it was and what was agreed to there, and that leaders agreed to two things: the increase to 3.5% to 5% of spending by 2035, and Secure's plan to keep us safe against various threats. Now, each country then has capability targets against the plan and is also assessed against the financial progress. They were making the point the UK is not meeting that Hague commitment at present. Other countries are, and NATO is inquiring about the UK. Now, the DIP has to resolve that, but the language of the largest increase since the end of the Cold War, or reviewing in 2029 or the next Parliament, does not match the Hague position. That dissonance, they're saying, the inability to say when we will be at 3% and 3.5% and when we will meet our capability targets is the problem, they told me. And the government, in their opinion, is going to have to renege on the Hague or satisfy the Hague commitment.
Right. Plenty to keep your eye on, Sian. So much to think about. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks.
Mike, it's just under a week since you went to the Munich Security Conference, and events since have been a reminder of just how long a time a week can be. Let's talk a bit about Iran now, which seemed like a side issue in Munich. We've been able to see the US military build-up continuing and Iran's exercises in the Strait of Hormuz. American sources are suggesting US forces are ready for strikes against Iran as early as this weekend. What do you think? Is this a game of brinkmanship or bluff?
It could be a bluff in the sense that President Trump, he definitely wants a deal because I think he knows he's not going to get a Ukraine deal. and he wants to have a deal before the midterm elections in November to show how effective he is, and he might rush for a deal with Iran. And although the deal will look very like the one he wrecked in 2018, the deal that Obama did in 2015, that won't matter. He'll say, we've got a deal. He'll pretend it's the best deal in history. And that's within his grasp, actually, just on nuclear issues alone. So it might all be a bluff in order to give him a deal in the next couple of weeks. But it is also the case, I think, that when American sources say they could be ready to go this weekend, they're right, because that's my calculation as well. The Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has been there now for 2 or 3 weeks in the Arabian Sea. And the Ford Carrier Strike Group yesterday was just off the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic. So I reckon that the Ford is going through the Gibraltar Strait today, or might have gone through overnight. I haven't looked yet. And at average cruising speed, that puts it off the coast of southern Cyprus in 4 days' time. And it could go more than cruising speed if it chose to, if its escorts are happy. So it could be on station, let's say, by Sunday, or even Saturday if it really pushed. So 2 carrier strike groups are there. We've seen lots of activities for tankers, KC-130 tankers. 16 of them have come through Mildenhall, some from Mildenhall and some from continental United States, from Sioux City, into Mildenhall and out again to bases in Greece and Bulgaria and Crete. We've seen the build-up of fighter aircraft, so we know they've got F-15s, F-18s on the carriers, of course, the Super Hornet. They've got F-22s in theatre, which is interesting. You don't normally see F-22s outside the continental United States. F-35s, and they've got B-2s at Diego Garcia for the stealth bombing. And then the final bit of the jigsaw is that we've seen 6 Sentry aircraft, the E-3, the AWACS, Airborne Warning and Control System aircraft. And I always say you can run a war with them, and they're in theatre now as well. So the Americans have got everything they need at sea. And they've got at least 2 attack submarines, maybe a 3rd Ohio-class submarine, I'm guessing. Maybe they're loaded with Tomahawk missiles. So they've got plenty of Tomahawk missiles. They've got plenty of aircraft. They've taken lots of ground-based air defence stuff in. About a week ago, a lot of C-5s and C-17s were on their way, delivering stuff to American bases. And we're pretty sure that stuff was anti-aircraft, ground-based air defence assets. So once the Ford gets within range in the Eastern Mediterranean, they're all set. Is it a bluff? It may be. I suspect it could be. But the temptation to pull the trigger, given the mood that President Trump is in at the moment, may be quite high.
And if military action does happen, how do you expect it to play out?
It won't be one-off. This is the whole point, that if decisive military action is to be taken against Iran, and I can't give you a sensible political rationale for this, but if it is, then it will take several days, we would assume. So first of all, there'll be attacks against air defence systems, against military installations, in order to, as it were, clear the skies of any likely opposition. And that will take a little time, and you have to revisit sites after they've been bombed. You have to check out what's been destroyed and destroy anything else. So we might see 2 or 3 days of that, sort of counter SEADs, suppression of enemy air defences, and then some sort of progressive dismantling of military installations in Iran, and maybe headquarters, maybe the IRGC, the Republican Guard, Islamic Republican Guard Corps headquarters. They all may be targeted. I mean, I would expect if it starts, it will go on for several days and maybe a couple of weeks. And it is entirely likely, if you also look at preparations taking place in Israel, to coincide with separate action that the Israelis may take within their sector, not only against Iran, but possibly against other elements of their enemies. So it may be the beginning of quite a big campaign that would last a fair old time. Won't be an overnight thing, and then we'll all assess the results.
And it's not risk-free for the US, is it?
It's not at all risk-free for the United States because, and this is what I think the Iranians are banking on, which is why they're hanging tough at the moment on this, if it is a prolonged campaign, they've got a fair chance they'll bring down a few aircraft. They'll do some damage. They'll block the Strait of Hormuz. They'll maybe find a way of attacking American ships. If a campaign goes for a week or 10 days or 2 weeks, the Americans, should be expected, will take some losses. Not very many, probably, but some. And even some losses will not play well with President Trump's MAGA base. So I think the Iranians probably feel that they can threaten enough damage to embarrass the president, even if the overall American action is, as you would expect, in a military sense, at least in a military sense, successful.
And Sir Keir Starmer in Munich again tried to walk his line between keeping ties with the US but also strengthening ties with Europe. And now Donald Trump has gone and publicly attacked the Prime Minister again over the Chagos deal and the future of Diego Garcia. What's going to happen there?
Well, I think the British government will just stick to its guns on Diego Garcia. It has to, really. And, I mean, this is the position that Britain, the Foreign Office, the Ministry of Defence and the State Department and the Pentagon in the United States have all agreed to. And the fact that the President keeps flip-flopping reflects the fact that different people, some of them from the United Kingdom, I have to say, very, very dishonourably in my view, are trying to find intermediaries to bend the President's ear. And he flip-flops. He's gone from approving the deal to disapproving of it, to approving it again, to disapproving of it yesterday, the day after the State Department said it was a good idea. And the point is that the State Department is full of professionals who know what they're talking about, which is why they have no influence in the White House itself. The essence of the Chagos deal is this. Chinese and Russian ships and aircraft will buzz the Chagos Islands in years to come because it is so strategically important. They're going to do that, whatever happens. Now, at the moment, Britain is on the wrong side of international law and the wrong side of world opinion over this. And the point is that if the Diego Garcia base belongs to Mauritius and is leased back to Britain and America in effect for the next 99 years, then there is a legal basis upon which that buzzing by Chinese and Russian ships and planes can be resisted. If we end up having to resist them on the basis of a legal uncertainty with the world set against us and international law set against us, we won't be able to do it very effectively. So getting it sorted out constitutionally means that when we get into conflict with the Russians and the Chinese over this, which we are going to in any case, it is better to be on the side of the good guys when we do it than on the side of the bad guys. That's what it all comes down to. And the fact that the State Department understands that, the Pentagon understands that, the Foreign Office understands it, the MOD understands it. The people who don't understand it seem to be those who want to make mischief out of it.
Thank you for that. That's really clear analysis of it. Munich now, a big deal event. It is pretty Western dominated, though. How's it gone down with our rivals and enemies, particularly Russia, which is banned from the event?
Yeah, I mean, they say, well, this is just a bunch of warmongers together. I mean, I must admit, I was surprised by the degree of unanimity in everybody who spoke that the Russians are an existential threat to Europe. And what they mean by that is whatever happens in Ukraine, for the foreseeable future, the Russians threaten the rest of us. And they'll threaten us, as it were, politically, through blackmail, through nuclear blackmail, and militarily, particularly if you're in a state that's near to them, like the Baltic states or Poland. And that's irrespective of whether Ukraine prevails in this conflict or is subdued by the conflict. And that unanimity, I was quite surprised by. I mean, nobody stood up at Munich and said, well, the Russians have got a point, or we ought to understand the Russian position a bit more. No, it wasn't like that. And, these meetings were a bit more like that a few years ago, but not now.
True, the Hungarians and the Slovaks as well?
Well, Hungary and Slovakia take a very different view. And the other thing you could see at Munich, just talking to people, is the way that they're just being isolated. I mean, between them, Hungary and Slovakia account for less than 2.5% of the GDP of the European Union. And if you add British GDP to that, then it's about 1.5%. So they are minnows. They don't make any difference to the economy of Europe. And they don't make much difference to NATO in terms of their contribution to NATO anymore. So in a way, they just get isolated. It makes unanimity impossible in NATO at 32, but it doesn't make action impossible because in reality, people just work around them. They're a nuisance, but they're not strategically significant to the rest of us in NATO and in the EU who are determined that the time has come for more resolute action.
And Mike, you had some upbeat things to say on the podcast from Munich with Simon. How are you feeling now that the dust has had a little time to settle?
Well, I think that Munich meeting will go down as a positive one because what was clear to me compared to the last Munich meeting of February last year was that a conceptual line has been crossed. I think, as I was saying there on that podcast, that this is sort of like a post-Davos Munich, that after Davos, the Europeans were determined that they weren't going to be pushed around all the time by the United States, that President Trump does need to be stood up to on some issues, even though we try to collaborate wherever we can, and that this Munich conference showed the Europeans accepting the fact that the transatlantic relationship is not in good shape and that the Europeans have got to be prepared to just carry on, if necessary, without the United States, even in opposition to the United States in some significant respects. And I would never have guessed that 2 or 3 years ago.
So cautiously optimistic, I guess.
Yes, I'm cautiously optimistic within a
cautiously realistic, I should say.
Yeah, I think of that line of poetry by, is it Janet Fence? She said, "I take into my arms more than I can bear to hold." And I often feel like that when I'm looking at defence issues. I take into my arms more than I can bear to hold.
Good news is, Mike, you've got strong arms. Mike, thank you so much. And thanks to all of our guests. Professor Michael Clarke and I will be back with another Sitrep next Thursday. And if you haven't already caught it, you can watch Mike and Simon with Sitrep live from the Munich Security Conference on the BFBS Forces News YouTube channel, or listen to the whole thing wherever you get your podcasts. From me, Kate Gerbeau, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.